Okay, well, we are going to get started. I was planning on trying to live stream this, but we're having some issues there. So if you're watching this online, you're watching it recorded at a little bit of a later day. We are continuing on looking at some different questions and answers that some people have submitted. And one of these questions and answers that have come up in a couple of your guys' questions that you've given me, although perhaps in a somewhat different form, is the question of what should we as Christians do, and what should we think about regarding Israel? And so what is God's plan for Israel today? Sorry, there we go. Got a lot of things going on here. What is God's plan for Israel today? Israel's a hot button issue in a lot of ways because there's, regardless of political beliefs and whatnot, it's a big issue in every corner of the world. Just about. You have, obviously, it's important because there's a lot of historical significance to the land of Israel. Israel is the key place for just about all of the Bible. And so there's a lot of historical significance tied to the land itself. You also have significance, though, because of modern day. You have lots of wars that are being waged there. And, just recently, there's been war in Israel that's been really significant in the past year and a half. And so there's a lot of people who have a lot of different beliefs on Israel. There's an interesting kind of subculture of feelings about Israel in American Christianity that I think is kind of interesting. You have it sometimes been called Christian Zionism, which has been, proposed by a lot of mainstream Christendom figures. Some people like Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and even President Jimmy Carter have been kind of lumped into that category of people that are not just supporters of Israel in a political sense, but in a religious sense. There's a quote from Jerry Falwell, and while I certainly don't endorse Jerry Falwell, this I think is indicative of where a lot of the American population is in regards to Israel. He says, "To stand against Israel is to stand against God. We believe that history and Scripture prove that God deals with nations in relation to how they deal with Israel." And that is, in a lot of ways, just kind of a summary of the perspective that a lot of people have on Israel today. And so let me ask you guys as we open up, what should we think about Israel? You talk with somebody, and I'm sure you all know people and know individuals. What is your thoughts, just kind of preliminarily, about Israel in this class?
Chosen nation.
Okay, the chosen nation.
Well, it was, yeah.
Was a chosen nation, okay. Maybe an asterisk there. Yeah.
I don't know that it's God's chosen nation today because we're not under the Old Testament law, we're under the New Testament laws.
Yeah. Perhaps not God's chosen nation today.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Well, they don't believe that Jesus is coming.
Yeah.
I mean, they still have their bar mitzvahs to see.
Yeah.
Their children is Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. Judaism is not Christianity. And so, there's well, all right. Well, those are just some thoughts. So let's get into this. And I think the way I want to handle this is kind of systematic. So here is a very, very, very rough timeline for Israel. You can talk forever about the history of Israel. There's so much, and this is just hitting some major events, and it's leaving out a lot of major events too. Around 1900 BC, you have God talks to Abraham, right? God gives Abraham this promise that there's going to be this land that he will go and inherit, and we'll look more at that promise here in a minute. Around 1400 BC, you have the conquest of Canaan, the fulfillment of that promise where Joshua leads the children of Israel out, continues on with Moses leading them out of Egypt, and then Joshua leads them into the promised land. Around 1040 BC or so, all of these dates are rough. You have David begins to rule, and you have a united Israel. Part of David's, the real job set before him is to unite all these tribes, and that's what David does. And you have a united Israel. Then, just 2 generations later, the kingdom's divided, north and south, with Abraham's grandson Rehoboam. 721, you had the Assyrians that come in and they conquer the north, the northern kingdom of Israel, which has been wicked ever since 930, right? It's been wicked for a long time. Then you have, in 587, the Babylonians come in, and they conquer not just the north, but they also conquer the south. And so Judah is captured, and you have the Babylonian exile. 539, the Persians come in and conquer the Babylonians, and de facto now are in control of Israel. Then in 332 BC, so now that we're in the intertestamental period, the period between the ending of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, you had the Greeks come in and conquer. Alexander the Great, he's like 32 years old or something. He conquers basically the entire world, and then he famously weeps because there's nothing left to conquer. But Greece comes in, and then Greece stays for a long time, and there's Alexander's kingdom's divided a whole bunch of different ways, but then in around 104 to 64 BC, you had the Maccabean period. You may have heard the term Maccabees. There were some rebels that fought against the ruling Greeks and overthrew them, and Israel earned its own independence for a period of time, for that to swiftly come to an end, and then 64, Rome takes over. And that's the world that Jesus comes into, right? When we look at the New Testament, Rome's in control of Israel. And Roman rule lasts in some form. This is a huge time skip here, and there's a lot of things I'm skipping over. But in the 1700s, the Ottoman Empire, which is Muslim, takes over and keeps it. You have a lot of flipping back and forth in that time period between crusades and caliphates and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, 1700s, the Ottoman Empire takes over. 1917, you have the ending of World War I, and you have the British Mandate, which you may have heard people talk about in the news. The British Empire controlled basically the whole world, just about, or large swaths of it, and the British were in control. The British Mandate ends in 1948, and when the British Mandate ends, you have the modern nation of Israel that comes out of that. And there's been a lot of things that have happened since then. But that is just a rough, 10,000-yard view looking at what's gone on in the history of Israel. So with all of that in mind, let's talk about some arguments for why people support Israel. People typically have a reason for what they believe, and especially when people hold things really strongly, they typically have a reason. Reason may not always be a good reason, may not always be an accurate reason, but they typically have a reason. So why might some people have not just political support for the nation of Israel, but why might some people, Christians in America in particular, why might they have some religious support for Israel?
Because they still think of it as like God's chosen nation.
Yeah. There's still a perception that Israel is God's chosen people. And not just in a sense of, perhaps even tied to the Jewish race, right? That's certainly part of it.
There's something in the Old Testament about, if you treat Israel right, and they'll treat you
Yeah.
Will prosper.
Yeah. There's a passage, and we're going to look at it here in a minute, where, if you treat Israel right, God will bless you. If you don't treat Israel right, God will curse you. That's a big, big factor. What else? All right, that's fine. So some will say Israel has a God-given right to the land. Go back all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. This is the promise that God makes to Abraham way back in the day. So in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So that's a really significant passage when God makes this promise to Abraham. It's an incredible thing that Abraham does, right? If God were to come to you and say, "Hey, I want you to go leave your family and leave the place you grew up on foot and go, miles and miles and miles and miles away, like walk the distance to basically I don't know, middle Georgia or something on foot." And that's a big ask. You're telling me to do something that's really difficult. And so Abram has the faith to do that, and we know that he does. And God keeps his word, which we know. But he says, if you go, then I'll give you a lot of blessings. There's the blessing of many nations, a great nation. I'll bless your name, make your name great. And that land that I'm going to show you and bring you to, that belongs to you. So that's certainly a big part of it. And then John hit on another one. God curses those who don't side with Israel. And that comes primarily from verse 3. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I'll curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So here you have pretty plain cut, right? God blesses those who bless Israel. He curses those who curse Israel. And you see that play out in the Bible, some too, right? Think about the Egyptians. When the Egyptians are a blessing to Israel, back in the parts of Genesis where they provide food, God blesses them greatly, right? And when Egypt arises and they don't know God and they abuse the Israelite people, God brings about his punishment. You had the 10 plagues and all the events that happened there in Exodus. And so God curses those who do not side with Israel. And there's another really big one that you guys haven't hit on, but I hear probably more than these other two and people that I've talked to. Any last guesses before we get to it?
When the Gentiles come to Jesus, like the woman
Mm-hmm.
who wanted help, he said that, I come, you're a Gentile, and this is, for the Jews
Yeah.
to begin with,
Yeah.
But then, she said, about the crumbs, even the dogs pick the crumbs under the table. And, it's kind of like, he mainly spoke to the Jews.
Yeah. Yeah. Getting back to what we talked a little bit about last week, there's these covenants. Israel has a special covenant with God. And the intention of that covenant is seen here in chapter 12. This relationship exists so that all might be blessed, which I think is interesting. The third reason that I hear a lot, and there's more than just these. This is a gross simplification of a lot of people's thoughts, but is that Israel needs to construct a third temple in order to usher in the eschaton or the end times. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But look at the passages that they'll turn to. So go to Matthew chapter 24. So Matthew chapter 24, you have this passage that Jesus is looking at Jerusalem, and his disciples are gathered around him. He laments over Jerusalem, and then they're like, they ask him about, where is it? Tell us, when will these things be, and when will be the sign of the coming of the age? And look at verse 16. This is a big verse, or verse 15 rather. So then, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Skip down to around verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in the heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Then he will send out all his angels and with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, one end of heaven to the other. And so there's a large contingent, and I would say this is the primary motivation behind a lot of people as to why they might support Israel, not just in a political, secular sense, but in a religious sense, is because there's a belief that there needs to be a third temple in order to usher in the end times, for the sequence of events to come that will bring about the return of Jesus. I think that's problematic, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what are your thoughts? You're talking with somebody, and they say some of these things. What do you say to them? How do you respond? Start with number one. God has given Israel a God-given right to the land. How would you respond to that?
Well, he did,
Yeah.
and the Israelites fell away so many times that he said, I'm done with you.
Yeah.
So he allowed these other nations to come in and take them.
Yeah.
The land. So I don't see that they have a God-given land right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So the land right was fulfilled. God said he would do it, and he did it. And he did it, right? He's not still doing it. He did it. So look at Joshua chapter 21. So Joshua is obviously the story of the Israelites' conquest into the promised land. And Joshua 21, I think, is a really clear passage here. Pick up verse 43. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all of the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them to rest on every side, not just as the Lord had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All had come to pass. And that's certainly true. You see Israel, just kind of this ragtag group, they're conquering the peoples of the land. They're conquering the city of Jericho. They're conquering Ai and, all these different things. That they win these battles when they're being faithful. And these are battles against nations and against peoples that are not respecters of God. And so God gives the people into the hand of Israel. And Israel conquers the land. And so there's a fulfillment here. All that God said he would do to their fathers, he's fulfilled. And so Israel now has possession of the land. And really, this possession of the land is going to last for a very long time, right? Go back to that timeline. We won't flip all the way back there, but Israel still inhabits the land for a very, very long time. But there's a lot of events that happen between Israel's, self-governance of the land and the conquests that happen later, right? And so when people say, well, Israel has a land right, well, I think the challenge there is that God gave them the land. And God upheld his end of the bargain. God said, you follow me and I'll give it to you. And he did. If that was the end of the story, there's a lot more to Israel's history that follows after that. So Israel's land right was conditional. Look at Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy is essentially Moses' final speech to Israel as Moses is about to die before Israel goes in and begins the conquest. Look at what he says, verse 21. The Lord will make you the pestilence, the Lord will make the pestilence stick to you until he is consumed off the land that you're entering in to take possession. This is not the right verse. I am so bad at that. I see something and then I totally mistype it. Well, I don't know what it was off the top of my head. But anyway, Deuteronomy talks about the conditional nature of it. I'll find that and I'll get it to you guys. So I'll make a little addendum. But anyway, Israel's land right is conditional upon their faithfulness. And of course, we know that Israel is anything but faithful. There's periods of great faithfulness, but there's also periods of great apostasy and periods where Israel falls away and they don't do the things they should do and they're not the people that they ought to be. And the natural result is the conquest, right? Why does God allow the Assyrians to conquer the north? Because they've not been faithful. Why does God allow the Babylonians to come in and conquer the south? Because they've not been faithful. And so their disobedience to God has lost them the right to continually inhabit the land that they've been promised. And you see that all throughout the prophets. Then you see Matthew 24. I think this is an interesting one. Jesus' prophecy in Matthew 24. We won't be able to get into all the intricacies of this, but people point to this often as a discussion of the end times, and I think it's just a misunderstanding of this whole passage. I'd say this is one of the most misunderstood passages in the entire Bible. Jesus begins Matthew chapter 24 talking about the destruction of the temple. There's not going to be two blocks left upon another, right? Is what he says. Matthew 24 verse 2, truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And so Jesus is prophesying about the destruction of the temple as he's lamenting over Jerusalem's continued unfaithfulness. He wishes he could rescue them, but they have rejected him time and time again. And so the consequences are they're going to be destroyed. And the disciples come to Jesus and they ask him two questions. You look at verse 3. He sat down on the Mount of Olives with his disciples, came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be? Question number 1. And what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? Question number 2. So the disciples ask two distinct questions, and Jesus answers two questions. And so verse 4, Jesus answered them. See that no one leads you astray. And then he goes into all of this. He talks about the abomination of desolation and all of these things. All of that is a response to question number 1. Question number 1 is, when is the temple going to be destroyed? And Jesus gives this answer. Here's the things to look for when the end has come. Not the end of the world, but the end of Jerusalem. And he gives all his answer. And then you skip down to verse 36, and he answers question number 2. So question number 2 was, when's going to be the sign of the end of the age? In verse 36, he moves from answering question 1 to now he's answering question 2. And he says, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. As it was, as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. People eating, drinking, being merry, but then suddenly destruction comes like a thief in the night. And so there's 2 questions being asked here. But when you conflate those 2 questions, you come up with some serious misunderstanding. And so when Jesus is talking about the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, what on earth is he talking about? Standing in the temple, right? Standing in the holy place. Well, you got to go back to Daniel, and we don't have time to give this the full, thorough flushing out that I would like to do. Daniel talks about the abomination which makes desolate. And what Daniel is referring to is an event that happens in the intertestamental period. There's a Greek king by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, as he likes to call himself, which means like the manifest one. But everybody called him Epimanes, which means the crazy one, the crazy man. But anyway, there's a period sometime before this that kind of brings about the whole Maccabean revolt, where this Greek general waltzes into the temple of God and sacrifices a pig on the altar of God. And the outrage is just enormous. And so you have this massive rebellion, and the temple has been made desolate. The holiness has been destroyed. And so
Now, where is that?
that happens in the intertestamental period. It's like 100 or so BC, somewhere around there.
That's more history than it is.
Yeah, that's the abomination of desolation. And so what Jesus is talking about here is another desolation of the temple. The temple is going to be desecrated. And he's talking about when the Romans come in. And I think this is really obvious when you look at the parallel passages. So flip over, look at Luke chapter 21. Luke chapter 21, verse 20. This is a parallel passage here. And, okay, we'll go here. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let the mountains, those who are in Judea, flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let those who are out in the country not enter. For these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that's written. Alas for women who are pregnant, and for those that are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth, and the wrath against the people. They'll fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by Gentiles until the time the Gentiles are fulfilled. You know, that's pretty obvious, right? This desolation is going to come when Jerusalem's surrounded by armies. And lo and behold, how is Jerusalem destroyed? The Roman army comes in and lays siege against the city of Jerusalem. They're literally surrounded. And he says, you better hope you're not pregnant then, because you see these armies coming, you better get out of town. And, you know, you better hope you're not old, you better hope you're not pregnant, you better not hope you're not, you know, in some condition where you can't travel, because get out of town. You know,
Because they're going to destroy.
yeah. If he's talking about the end of the world, does it matter if you're pregnant? Does it matter if you're old? Yeah, of course it doesn't. But if you have to flee an army coming, well, yeah, it matters. And so this just comes from a misunderstanding of Matthew 24. And besides all of that, Jesus says, you know, these things, look at Matthew 24, verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word shall not pass away. And so Jesus says, listen, all these things that I've been talking about, that's going to happen in this generation. You know, you all are going to be the ones to see this. And so if this is talking about the end of the world, this section, then we got a problem because we're still here, right? And that generation, as far as I know, are all dead because that was 2,000 years ago. So, how should we think of Israel? That's I think, the question. I think we need to realize that modern Israel is not biblical Israel. And I think that's really significant. Biblical Israel is a theocratic monarchy, right? David is God's chosen man. He's God's anointed. Before him, you had the judges, and before him, you had Moses. And so this is a country that is God's the one on top. And modern Israel may share a name, but it's a name, right? It's a secular state created 76 years ago. And so I don't think that modern Israel is apples to apples with ancient biblical Israel. I think that God's judgment came upon ancient Israel. And he said, you guys I've given you everything. I've given you all these chances. And you guys have squandered it over and over again. And so the consequences were that they were drug off by the Babylonians. And I think that Rome was, the nail in the coffin for them. And so I don't think that modern Israel is the same thing as biblical Israel. And then we talk about, you have something?
So for the most part, Israel today, modern as you say, does not take the Bible to be their salvation or their...
Well, modern Israel is, I think they're the only Jewish state. So a huge, significant population of them, I don't know the exact numbers, are Jewish people. And as Jews, they take the Bible very seriously. There's also a significant Muslim population and a minority Christian population there. But there's also a large secular population. But, that's not even the heart of the issue. It's the fact that they're just not what they were, right? God is not the one calling the shots here. God is not telling them what to do through the prophets, right? It's just not what it was. And so it shares a name, and that's, I think, about it, in a geographic location. So let's talk about this chosen nations thing. God does not have a chosen nation today. There was a time where God had Israel as his chosen nation.
Chosen nation?
We're told that we're his chosen people.
Well,
We have a
just
priesthood.
just listen. So God does not have a chosen nation state today. To say that God has a individual country that is his country and all the other countries are not his country, I think is not biblical. God did not reject Israel. Israel rejected God. And so you look at passages like Romans chapter 11, verse 1, verse 5. There's this talk about a remnant of Israel. God has been faithful, Israel has not, yet there still remains a remnant of Israel that has been. And so the result is that God has opened the doors and grafted in the Gentiles. And that's what Romans 11, 17, and 19 through 22, and all that talks about. Look at Ephesians chapter 2. We'll read this because it's a little bit shorter and we're running a little short on time. It says essentially the same thing. So Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12 through 16. He says, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel. What does that mean, commonwealth of Israel? What is a commonwealth? Aside from Georgia or Virginia and Kentucky.
Where are you again?
Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12. Yeah. What was that?
The average people,
Yeah.
the community.
Yeah. If you're a member of a state or a member of a commonwealth, you share in the collective, right? He's saying, you Gentiles, you were estranged from it. You had no part of it. Estranged from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope, without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in the place of two, so making peace. And so what he says is, there's a time where you were far off, you Gentiles, and the Jews were in near. You weren't a part of this in-group, but now what God has done is he's opened the gates, he's brought you in who were once far off, and he's made you sons. That's the whole Ephesians 2 thing. So then, verse 19, you're no longer strangers and aliens, you're now fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and so on. And so now you who are far off, you're brought in, now you're God's people too. And so to say that the modern nation of Israel is, in fact, God's chosen nation, I don't think is accurate, because God doesn't have a chosen nation state today. It's not Israel, and quite frankly, it's not the United States either. What God does have is a chosen nation in the sense of those who are believers and have chosen to align with him, regardless of your national borders or what's on your passport. Those are God's chosen people today. And you see that in 1 Peter, right? Look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 2 through 9. Here you have, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you're God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Those are echoing the words that God spoke through Moses to the physical nation of Israel way back when. If you'll be my people, then I'll be your God. You're a holy nation, a royal priesthood. You are my intermediary among all the nations. Now he says this to Gentiles. This is not about national borders anymore. The gospel has transcended those. This is about those who would be believers and those who will be faithful to the commandments that God has given. We're not under the old law. The old covenant has been done away with. Now we're under the covenant of Christ. That's what we talked about last week towards the end. And all of those that would be faithful to God have a place in God's family, have a place in God's nation. And so when we think about Israel, I think these are the things to keep in mind. Physical Israel today, the nation of Israel today, is not the same as ancient Israel. Also, God does not have a chosen nation state today. God's chosen nation is all believers that would follow him and keep his commandments.
Well, in Romans, he says he has no respect for a person.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if we're believers, faithful, then of course he chooses us.
Sure. Yeah. And so as far as, what do I think about modern day Israel personally? Personally, I think it's a great place. It's the best place in the Middle East. I support it, but my support's primarily political and not religious, right? I don't support it because I think it's going to be a necessary player in bringing about the coming of Christ. I think God's got that handled. And so that's not why I support it. I support it because in a part of the country where there's a lot of bad things and a lot of bad people, they're about as good as you can get. So that's my thoughts. I'm just thankful that God chose those who are far off to bring him near. All right. Thank you, guys.
It may